Welcome back to Midnight at WolfCloud Station. I'm your host, Sierra Sterling. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, tucked deep within the jagged, pine-choked spine of the Sierra Nevada mountains, lies a place that time and mercy seemingly forgot. The Feather River Canyon is a landscape defined by its suffocating isolation. The trees here grow so incredibly thick that they blot out the sun by mid-afternoon, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. If you scream in these woods, the sound is instantly swallowed by the rushing water of Spanish Creek and the endless rustle of the towering ponderosa pines. It is a place of undeniable, haunting beauty, but it is also a place where secrets can easily be buried beneath the damp earth and forgotten by the outside world. In the spring of 1981, the Keddie Resort was a community barely holding on to its former glory. Decades earlier, it had been a bustling railroad stop, a rustic paradise for wealthy vacationers escaping the oppressive heat of the Sacramento Valley. Families would take the train up the mountain, renting out the pristine wooden cabins, fishing in the creek, and eating at the lodge. But by the early 1980s, the resort had decayed into a forgotten enclave of low-income housing. The paint on the wooden cabins was peeling in long, brittle strips. The roofs sagged under the weight of decades of winter snows. The people who lived in Keddie during this era were often those looking to disappear, those running from their pasts, or those who simply had nowhere else to turn. It was into this rugged, isolated community that 36-year-old Glenna Susan Sharp, known to everyone simply as Sue, arrived in search of sanctuary. Sue Sharp had spent years trapped in a deeply abusive marriage on the East Coast. Desperate to protect her 5 children from the violence and volatility of their father, she packed whatever she could fit into her vehicle and drove 3,000 miles across the country. She initially settled in a small trailer park in Quincy, Northern California, where her brother Don lived. But by the winter of 1979, seeking more space for her growing family, Sue and her children moved down the canyon into Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. Cabin 28 was a 2-story wooden structure that sat near the middle of a dirt loop, just steps away from the neighbors. It was drafty, cramped, and worn down by the elements. The basement bedroom could only be accessed from the outside, meaning the door was always left unlocked so the occupant could come upstairs to use the bathroom. It was not a perfect home, but to Sue Sharp, it was a fortress. It was a place where she could finally breathe without fear. She shared the home with her 15-year-old son John, her 14-year-old daughter Sheila, her 12-year-old daughter Tina, and her 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, aged 10 and 5. Despite the grinding poverty and the constant struggle to make ends meet, the Sharp family was tightly knit. They relied heavily on one another. The older children helped raise the younger ones. They were actively building a new life, completely unaware that a suffocating darkness was closing in around them. The timeline of April 11th, 1981, began like any other Saturday in the canyon. The air was crisp, holding the last lingering, biting chill of winter. At around 11:30 in the morning, Sue, along with her daughters Sheila and young Greg, piled into their car to drive to the nearby town of Quincy. They were heading to Gansner Field to pick up 10-year-old Rick from his baseball tryouts. On the way, they spotted Sue's oldest son, John, hitchhiking with his best friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. Hitchhiking was a common and widely accepted mode of transit in the rural mountains back then. Sue pulled over, and the boys climbed in, laughing and joking as the family drove the 6 miles back up the winding canyon road to Keddie. Later that afternoon, around 3:30, John and Dana decided they were bored. They wanted to head back down to Quincy to hang out with friends. They were typical teenagers, restless and looking for entertainment in a place that offered very little. They stood by the side of State Route 70, thumbs out, waiting for a ride. They were seen by locals walking around the downtown Quincy area as the afternoon bled into the evening. Back at Cabin 28, the evening settled into a quiet, comfortable domestic rhythm. As the sun dipped below the tree line and the shadows stretched across the dirt roads of the resort, the temperature plummeted. Inside the cabin, the television was glowing, casting a flickering blue light across the faded green carpet. At around 8 o'clock, 12-year-old Justin Smart, A friend of the younger Sharp boys who lived just down the street in cabin 26 arrived to spend the night. Justin, Rick, and Greg claimed the smaller adjacent bedroom. They spent the evening roughhousing, playing, and watching television. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp walked the 15 feet across the dirt lot to cabin 27 to spend the night with her friends, the Seabolt family. It was a completely routine sleepover, so close to home that she didn't even bother packing a bag. She just walked out the front door, leaving her mother and her younger sister Tina inside. By 10 o'clock, the lights in cabin 28 began to flick off. Justin, Rick, and Sue were known to have been watching the television show The Love Boat before settling down for the night. Tina had returned from briefly visiting the Seabolts to wash some dishes in the kitchen, before going to bed in the room she shared with her mother and Sheila. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon. The darkness over Keddie was absolute. No one knows exactly what time John Sharp and Dana Wingate returned to the resort. No one knows exactly when the front door to cabin 28 was opened, or if it was forced by the intruders. But sometime in the dead of night, the quiet sanctuary that Sue Sharp had built for her family was breached by sheer, unadulterated evil. The morning of April 12th dawned cold and gray. At around 8 a.m., Sheila Sharp woke up in the Seabolt cabin. She was scheduled to attend church that morning, so she stretched, got out of bed, and walked the 15 feet back to cabin 28 to quickly change her clothes. She walked up the wooden steps. She reached for the doorknob. It wasn't locked. Sheila pushed the door open, stepping out of the bright morning light and into the dim, claustrophobic living room of her own home. What she saw in that room defies human comprehension. The smell hit her first, the thick, metallic, suffocating stench of copper and bodily fluids. Then, her young eyes adjusted to the gloom. The green carpet was soaked in dark, pooling crimson. The living room had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. 3 bodies lay on the floor, battered and bound so savagely that, for a moment, Sheila's teenage mind could not even process what she was looking at. They were tied with white medical tape and appliance wire. There was blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling. Panic, absolute and primal, seized Sheila's chest. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She turned on her heel, burst back out the front door, and ran as fast as her legs could carry her back to the Seabolt's cabin, gasping for air, her world forever shattered. The nightmare of cabin 28 had only just begun. After Sheila Sharp fled the unimaginable horrors of cabin 28, she burst through the front door of the Seabolt home, frantic, screaming and hyperventilating. The adults in the house immediately sprang into action. Jamie Seabolt ran across the dirt lot, approaching the quiet, deathly still cabin. He didn't dare go through the front door. Instead, he crept around to the side window, the specific window to the bedroom where 10-year-old Rick, 5-year-old Greg, and 12-year-old Justin Smart had spent the night. Jamie tapped on the glass. Incredibly, miraculously, the boys were alive. They were awake, sitting in the bedroom, completely unharmed by the violence that had destroyed the rest of the house. Jamie hoisted the window open and carefully lifted the 3 children out, one by one, dropping them into the cold morning air, ensuring they never had to walk through the living room. They never saw the slaughter that lay just a few feet beyond their bedroom door. At 8:05 a.m., Jan Albin, the co-owner of the Keddie resort, dialed the Plumas County Sheriff's Office to report a potential homicide. Deputy Hank Clement was the first to arrive on the scene. He approached the cabin, his hand resting tightly on his service weapon. He pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The interior of cabin 28 was a masterclass in human depravity. The sheer, overwhelming violence inflicted upon the victims was staggering. 15-year-old John Sharp was closest to the front door. He was lying face up, his hands bound securely with thick, white medical tape. His throat had been slashed so viciously it shocked the seasoned deputies. 17-year-old Dana Wingate was positioned next to John, lying on his stomach. His head rested partially on a sofa pillow. Dana had been brutally bludgeoned, sustaining massive head injuries, and had ultimately been manually strangled to death. His ankles were tied with a thick electrical cord that was cruelly tethered to John's bound ankles, linking the two teenage boys together in death. And then there was Sue. The 36-year-old mother of 5 was found lying on her side near the living room sofa. She was naked from the waist down, though investigators noted her body appeared to have been repositioned or covered after the attack, indicating a grotesque form of staging by the killers. She had been tightly gagged with a blue bandana and her own undergarments, secured firmly with layers of medical tape. She had suffered severe defensive wounds on her arms, indicating she had fought desperately for her life against multiple attackers. She was stabbed in the chest, and her throat was cut so deeply that the blade had actually nicked her spine. But it was the blunt force trauma that painted the most disturbing picture of the killer's arsenal. The victims had been battered with at least 2 different hammers. And on the side of Sue Sharp's head, pathologists would discover a highly distinct, patterned impact wound. It was the precise imprint of the butt of a Daisy 880 Powerline BB and pellet rifle. A piece of the rifle's sight was even found broken off on the living room floor. The violence was not contained merely to the bodies. The forensic footprint of the room suggested a chaotic, frenzied, and drawn-out struggle. Blood was not just pooled on the faded green carpet, it was cast off onto the ceiling. It was smeared across the furniture. It was spattered across the cheerful, ivy-patterned wallpaper of the living room, and even found on the bedding in the bedroom Sue shared with her daughters. The bottoms of Sue's bare feet and the soles of one of the boys' shoes were coated in blood, proving that they had been mobile, walking or fighting through the blood on the floor before they were finally subdued. The killers had brought a terrifying toolkit with them: medical tape, electrical wire, a pellet rifle, and at least 1 hammer. But they also used weapons found inside the house. A bent steak knife and a bloody claw hammer were left resting on a wooden side table in the living room. In a bizarre and chilling touch of staging, Sheila Sharp's flute case had been intentionally placed right on top of the murder weapons. As the Plumas County Sheriff's deputies secured the perimeter, stringing yellow crime scene tape across the dirt paths of the Keddie resort, a horrifying realization washed over the investigators. They had accounted for Sue. They had accounted for John and Dana. They had extracted the 3 young boys from the side window. Sheila was safe next door. But someone was missing. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was gone. Her bed was empty. There was no sign of a violent struggle in her specific bedroom, but a dark smudge of blood was found on the wooden handrail of the steep back stairs leading out of the kitchen. Had she woken up during the slaughter? Had she walked out into the living room and seen the faces of the killers? Was she abducted simply to be silenced, or was she the primary target of this intrusion all along? The FBI was immediately called in to assist with the suspected kidnapping of a minor. Search dogs scoured the dense woods surrounding Spanish Creek. Helicopters chopped through the airspace over the Feather River Canyon, searching the dense canopy of pines for any sign of a frightened 12-year-old girl. But the woods gave up nothing. Tina Sharp had vanished like smoke in the wind. How could this happen? How could 3 people be systematically butchered, bludgeoned with hammers and a pellet rifle, and a 12-year-old girl abducted, without a single person in the densely packed Keddie resort hearing a thing? The Seabolts, living just 15 feet away in cabin 27, claimed they slept through the entire night without hearing a single sound. The only faint clue came from a couple living in cabin 16, who told police they were awakened at 1:15 a.m. by what sounded like muffled screaming coming from the direction of the rear area of cabin 28. But they hadn't gotten out of bed. They hadn't checked on their neighbors. They hadn't called the police. In a community of outcasts, the silence was deafening. The residents of Keddie locked their doors, closed their blinds, and absolutely refused to speak. The fear in the air was palpable. Whoever had done this was capable of unspeakable savagery, and they had vanished into the night without leaving a single identifiable fingerprint behind. When a crime of this staggering magnitude occurs in a closed, isolated community, investigators don't usually have to look far to find the fracture point. The web of relationships in the Keddie resort was tight, tangled, and notoriously toxic. And almost immediately, The eyes of seasoned law enforcement drifted across the dirt loop, directly toward Cabin 26. Cabin 26 was home to Marty Smart, his wife Marilyn, and her 2 sons, including young Justin, who had ironically spent the night of the murders in the Sharp household. Marty Smart was a man who walked around with a dark cloud over his head. He had arrived in Keddie a year prior to work as a cook at the hotel restaurant, but had recently lost his job. According to local investigators, Marty supported his family by manufacturing hashish and dealing drugs, allegedly running product out of a known drug house located right in the resort. Marty was highly volatile, deeply possessive, and wildly jealous. His own wife's aunt later told investigators that while living in Phoenix, Marty had gotten into an argument with his father and actually went out and purchased materials to build a bomb to blow up his father's house. She reported that he practiced throwing a hatchet in his yard and that he spent hours obsessively reading the Bible, becoming fanatical about the perceived moral failings of others. Just 10 days before the massacre in Cabin 28, Marty brought a friend to live with him. Severin John Baubed, known to everyone in the canyon as Beau, was a hardened ex-convict. Because space in the rustic cabin was at an absolute premium, Beau slept on the couch in the living room. Beau allegedly had deep ties to organized crime in Chicago and the surrounding areas. Beau was the muscle. Marty was the fuse. On the night of April 11th, just hours before the murders, Marty Smart, his wife Marilyn, and Beau Baubed walked into the Keddie backdoor bar. In a rundown, rural loggers' tavern where the uniform was strictly denim and flannel, Marty and Beau were inexplicably wearing 3-piece suits and sunglasses. It was a bizarre, highly conspicuous display. They were loud. They were aggressive. When the bartender changed the music from country to rock, Marty became furious, complaining loudly to the management and drawing the attention of the entire room. To seasoned investigators, it looked exactly like 2 men desperately trying to manufacture an airtight alibi. They left the bar, allegedly returning to Cabin 26, before Marty and Beau headed back to the bar for last call without Marilyn. But what was the motive? Why would these men brutally slaughter a mother and 2 teenage boys? The answer, investigators theorize, lies in a toxic love triangle. Sue Sharp was a fiercely independent woman who had survived domestic abuse. According to Plumas County Special Investigator Mike Gamberg, Sue had been secretly counseling Marty's wife, Marilyn, advising her to pack up her children and leave Marty because of his violent, abusive behavior and his serial infidelity. Marty Smart allegedly found out about these private counseling sessions, and to a man whose entire identity was built on control and absolute possession, Sue Sharp became a threat that had to be eliminated. Many investigators believe John and Dana simply arrived home at the wrong time and were killed to eliminate witnesses, and Tina was taken because she saw their faces. But the local sheriff's department, led by Sheriff Doug Thomas, seemed to aggressively fumble the investigation of Marty and Beau. Sheriff Thomas, bizarrely, had been the previous tenant of Cabin 28 before the Sharps moved in. He and Marty Smart were reportedly good friends. Marty would even ride along with the sheriff on his nightly patrols. When the California Department of Justice was called in to assist the overwhelmed local authorities, they didn't send homicide detectives. They sent Special Agents Harry Bradley and P.A. Krim directly from the Organized Crime Unit. It was a move that baffled local deputies and immediately sparked rumors of a cover-up involving drug running and federal informants. A few weeks after the murders, Marty Smart left Keddie and traveled to Reno, Nevada, where he visited a Veterans Administration counselor. During his 7th session, Marty did the unthinkable. He confessed. According to the counselor's records, Marty Smart stated with zero emotion, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." The counselor noted that Marty's demeanor was flat, completely devoid of stress, until he mentioned 12-year-old Tina. When asked why Tina didn't run away, Marty chillingly indicated that he had incapacitated her, stating, "She saw the whole thing. I couldn't have a witness." When the counselor urged Marty to turn himself in to the police, Marty just smiled. He boasted that he had taken a polygraph test for the local sheriff, saying, "I beat it. Those things are easy to beat. I was lying, and they let me go. The counselor immediately called the Department of Justice, reaching out directly to agents Bradley and Krim to report the confession of a quadruple murderer. The agents met with the counselor, listened to the evidence, and then they dismissed the confession as hearsay. They buried it. No arrest was made. Marty Smart walked free. Instead of arresting the men in the three-piece suits, Sheriff Thomas focused his attention on 12-year-old Justin Smart, who had survived in the adjacent bedroom. The sheriff, who had recently taken a brief training course in hypnosis, personally hypnotized the traumatized boy. Under hypnosis, Justin told a bizarre, dreamlike story of being on a boat, seeing two men throw John and Dana overboard, and watching a man with a pocket knife cut Sue Sharp in the chest while holding a hammer in his other hand. Based on this highly questionable, hypnotically induced dream sequence from a traumatized child, law enforcement had an amateur artist draw up composite sketches of two unknown suspects. The sketches featured men in their late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair, wearing gold-framed sunglasses. The sketches were released to the public, sending the entire investigation on a wild goose chase, while the real killers, the men living just 15 feet away in cabin 26, packed their bags and drove out of the Feather River Canyon, leaving the ghosts of Keddie behind. For 3 agonizing years, the ghost of Tina Sharp haunted the pines of Plumas County. The public narrative held that the 12-year-old girl was a victim of a random, transient predator, someone who had slipped in and out of the canyon unseen. But the truth was far colder and far closer to home. On April 11, 1984, the exact 3-year anniversary of the massacre in cabin 28, a man collecting empty bottles in the deep, remote woods of neighboring Butte County made a grim discovery. Near a place called Camp 18, roughly 62 miles from the Keddie resort, he found the cranium of a human skull and a portion of a jawbone resting in the brush. Forensic pathologists soon confirmed the devastating truth. It was Tina. She had been murdered, and her body unceremoniously dumped in the sprawling wilderness of the Feather Falls area. But the discovery of Tina's remains triggered an event even more sinister than the find itself. Shortly after the local news broadcast the discovery of the unidentified skull at Feather Falls, a call came into the Butte County Sheriff's dispatcher. The caller's voice was calm, anonymous, and chillingly specific. The man on the tape said, "I was watching the news and they were talking about the skull they found. And I was just wondering if they thought of the murder up in Keddie in Plumas County a couple years ago where a 12-year-old girl was never found." The caller knew exactly who the remains belonged to, long before the forensic pathologists confirmed it. It was a taunt, a morbid, psychopathic victory lap. And what did law enforcement do with this incredibly crucial piece of evidence? They put the cassette tape in a manila envelope. They tossed it into the bottom of a cardboard evidence box, and they never opened it. Keddie cabin murders went ice cold. The cabins of the resort were allowed to rot. The community withered, destroyed by the economic and psychological impact of the unresolved slaughter. The primary suspects, Marty Smart and Bo Baubed, lived out their lives without ever facing a judge or a jury. Baubed died in Chicago in 1988. Smart died of cancer in Portland, Oregon, in the year 2000. With the prime suspects in the grave, it seemed the absolute truth had been buried with them. But the victims' families never gave up, and in 2013, a monumental shift occurred in Plumas County. Greg Hagwood, a man who had gone to high school and worked with John Sharp and Dana Wingate during the summer before their deaths, was elected sheriff of Plumas County. Sheriff Hagwood knew the boys. He knew the geography. And he knew, fundamentally, that the original investigation was a travesty of justice. Hagwood immediately brought special investigator Mike Gamberg out of retirement. Gamberg was a bulldog, a relentless former deputy who had actually known the teenage victims personally, but had been deliberately kept away from the original investigation by the corrupt chain of command. Gamberg and Hagwood cracked the seals on the old evidence boxes, blowing off decades of dust. They found the unopened envelope at the very bottom of the box. They listened to the tape of the anonymous caller from 1984, and they realized, with sickening clarity, that the original investigators had actively covered up the crime, hiding evidence to protect the killers. In 2016, Gamberg acted on an old rumor and a metal detector. He waded into a shallow, dried-up pond situated just down the road from the Keddie resort. Buried deep in the mud, he found it, a steel hammer. It wasn't just any hammer. It matched the precise physical description of the specific hammer that Marty Smart had casually mentioned to the DOJ agents he had lost, right around the time of the murders. Sheriff Hagwood noted that the hammer was placed in that pond intentionally, hidden away by someone who knew exactly what it had been used for. Then came the DNA. Gamberg submitted a piece of white medical tape, the very tape used to bind the victims, for advanced forensic testing. In 2018, he announced a bombshell to the public. They had recovered an identifiable DNA profile from the adhesive side of the tape, and it didn't belong to a dead man. It matched a known, living suspect who was inside the cabin that night. The most damning piece of the puzzle, however, was a single piece of paper. Shortly after the murders, while hiding out from the fallout, Marty Smart wrote a handwritten letter to his estranged wife, Marilyn, begging her to take him back. Marilyn eventually handed the letter over to the authorities, who promptly ignored it. Gamberg found it in the files. The ink on the page reads like a direct confession from the gates of hell. Marty wrote to his wife, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" I've bought it with 4 people's lives. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office, under Hagwood and Gamberg, has publicly stated they believe the murders were a premeditated hit executed by Smart and Baubed, aided by accomplices who helped dispose of the weapons, cover the tracks, and abduct little Tina. And they believe those accomplices are still walking the streets today. Cabin 28 is gone now. It was condemned and demolished in 2004, the earth bulldozed flat, erasing the physical footprint of the slaughter. The Keddie resort is quiet, reclaimed by the encroaching forest and the endless rush of Spanish Creek. But the ghosts of the Sharp family and Dana Wingate have not been silenced. The DNA is loaded in the system. The audio tapes are being analyzed by the FBI. The net is slowly, finally, tightening. The killers thought they could wash the blood from their hands in the shadows of the Sierra Nevadas, protected by a badge and a silent town. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, even from the bottom of a muddy pond. Keep the doors locked, keep the volume low, tonight's file is open.